On my birthday, my son-in-law laughed in front of everyone and said, "Your garage is just a graveyard of junk." The words fell like hammers, and no one at the table defended me. My daughter stared down at her plate. The grandchildren giggled as if it were a harmless joke, but to me it was a knife. They thought my tools, my collection of worn iron and wood, my companions of 50 years, were nothing more than rust and shame. That night I returned to my garage, the only place where silence had weight and meaning. The bulb above flickered weakly, casting shadows across rows of hammers, wrenches, screwdrivers, and saws. Every piece bore the scars of time, yet in my eyes they were not relics, they were witnesses. With these hands and these tools I had built cribs and cabinets, repaired engines, saved neighbors stranded in storms, and kept bread on the table when the world turned its back. The smell of oil lingered like memory, sharp and honest. Dust rested thick across the shelves, but under it lay the polish of 1,000 touches, the shine of a man's work that could not be erased. Each dent in the steel carried a story. The night a farmer's tractor broke before the harvest. The evening when a young man's motorbike carried him to see his newborn child because I stayed awake repairing it. The day I built a table where my own family once sat proudly before laughter turned into scorn. Yet now, those same children, grown and proud, had decided my life's work was no more than clutter. To them, the garage was an embarrassment, a reminder of a man too stubborn to move on, too foolish to know that the world had changed. They called me old-fashioned, outdated, unnecessary. They didn't see that behind every mark of rust was resilience. Behind every crack in the wood was sacrifice. I sat on my old wooden stool, my fingers brushing across a spanner that had once saved a man's life on the highway when his car failed at midnight. The memory glowed warm in my chest, even as shame from the day's mockery clung to me like cold rain. My son-in-law's words repeated in my ears, a graveyard of junk. But I knew better. The garage was no graveyard. It was a cathedral of survival, of endurance, of craft. And though they mocked me, though even my own blood turned laughter into betrayal, I whispered to myself in the silence, one day they will understand. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please, write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever faced something similar in your life, when people mocked what you treasured? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. The whispers began softly, but they carried more weight than any shout. Relatives passing by the open garage door would glance in, their eyes filled with amusement, their lips curled in ridicule. Neighbors slowed their steps on the sidewalk, shaking their heads as if walking past a foolish man who could not let go of the past. What they saw were boxes of rust, broken machines, wooden shelves sagging under the weight of old iron. What they never cared to see was the life inside those walls, the history forged in sweat and sacrifice. The cruelest sting came not from strangers, but from those who shared his blood. His own family carried that same dismissive look, as though the garage was a stain on their pride, a corner of the house they wished could be hidden from the world. He heard the laughter ripple during gatherings, his son-in-law speaking lightly of the old scrapyard, his grandchildren repeating the words without shame, learning to mock what they never understood. Their voices floated through the evening air, sinking deep into his chest like stones. Inside, the old man sat quietly at his bench, the wrench resting cold in his hand. He tightened his grip until his knuckles whitened, not out of anger, but to hold back the ache in his heart. He knew silence was his last dignity. To answer their mockery with words would only fuel their arrogance. Better to let them laugh. Better to let them forget that these hands once built their homes, their tables, their chairs. Better to let them believe rust was all that remained. But the whispers followed him everywhere, turning into shadows that clung to his steps. At church, at the market, even on the street, he felt eyes resting on him, eyes that carried the echo of those mocking tones. It was as if the world conspired to erase the worth of his labor, to reduce decades of skill and endurance into nothing but old metal piled in a shed. And though he held his head high, each night when the door of the garage closed and silence returned, the weight of betrayal pressed harder against his chest. In that silence he whispered not to them, but to himself. One day these hands will speak louder than their laughter. One day this rust they despise will shine brighter than their pride. It happened one evening, when the family gathered under one roof, the table filled with food, and the air thick with chatter. Laughter rose easily around him, but none of it reached his heart. He sat quietly, listening, trying to take comfort in the presence of his daughter and her children. Yet the warmth of that moment collapsed in a single glance, a smirk curling across the face of the man who had married his daughter. With careless ease, the son-in-law turned the conversation toward him, toward the garage, toward the tools that had been his life's companions. His words, sharp though spoken lightly, carried enough venom to silence the table. The place he called his workshop was dismissed with contempt, reduced to a scrapyard, a relic of a world no one needed anymore. His daughter's eyes fell to her plate, shame flashing for an instant before surrendering to silence. She could not defend him, not against the man she shared her life with. The grandchildren giggled under their breath, repeating the cruel rhythm of mockery they had already learned from their father. In that instant, the old man was not a father, not a grandfather, not a craftsman who had given years of his strength. He was nothing more than an object of ridicule in the eyes of his own blood. He sat still, his back straight, his face a mask of calm, but inside his chest, the weight grew heavier than iron. Every word chipped away at him, not because they doubted his tools, but because they erased his worth. To them, his garage was a shameful corner best forgotten, an embarrassment in an age of modern convenience. They never understood that each worn handle had once been a lifeline, each dent in the steel a story of resilience, each scarred blade proof of hands that refused to give in to poverty, to hunger, to despair. He did not reply. His silence was his only armor.
He lifted his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly, and let the noise of the table wash over him. But deep inside, something shifted. Betrayal was no longer just whispers on the street. It had entered his own home. It had taken a seat at his own table. It had spoken through the mouth of the man who should have shown him respect.
That night, when the gathering was over, he returned once more to his garage. He closed the door behind him, shut out the world, and sat among his tools. The shadows seemed to lean closer, listening as he placed his hand on the cold steel of his wrench. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "They believe no one needs this anymore. They believe no one needs me anymore. But they are wrong. Time will show them." The night was quiet when they left, their laughter still echoing faintly in the air as the door closed behind them. He did not linger in the dining room, did not look again at the empty plates and half-drunk glasses that only moments ago had been full of noise and voices. Instead, his feet carried him, heavy and slow, to the place where his heart still lived. The garage door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of oil and iron rushed out to greet him like an old friend. The silence inside was thick, but it was not cruel. It was honest. He reached out his hand and let his fingers glide across the cold steel of a rusted wrench, the surface rough and scarred. To anyone else it was just metal, a forgotten relic, but to him it was memory. He could still feel the weight of it in his younger hands when he stood on the roadside years ago, repairing the car of a stranger who had broken down in the middle of winter. He remembered the man's trembling hands as he pressed coins into his palm, not knowing that the old mechanic had refused payment and left before thanks could be given. Those stories were buried in every dent, every mark, every tool, but no one cared to look deep enough to see them. To his family, to his neighbors. This garage was nothing but a tomb of rust. They did not see the nights he stayed awake, long after the world had gone to sleep, grinding metal, cutting wood, piecing together broken machines so someone else could work, so someone else's child could eat. They did not see the sacrifices hidden in the grease that stained his shirts, in the blisters that carved his palms, in the quiet pride he once carried when someone drove away smiling because he had given them hope. Now all of it was forgotten. Years of service, years of labor, years of devotion to his craft were erased by a single word: junk. He sat on the worn stool in the corner, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the rows of tools lined neatly on their shelves. They looked back at him like silent companions, loyal, steadfast, carrying truths that no one else wanted to acknowledge. His heart grew heavy, not only with grief, but with the sharp edge of betrayal. The people who should have known him best had chosen not to see him at all. The man who once built their tables, repaired their roofs, and kept their cars alive had become invisible in his own home. He pressed his hand harder against the steel, letting its chill ground him, whispering a promise only the walls could hear. One day, these tools will speak for me. One day, they will see what I see. At first it was subtle, small remarks that slipped into conversations, half smiles hidden behind cups of wine. But as months passed, the whispers grew bolder, turning into laughter that rang across the dinner table. Every family gathering became a stage where his dignity was chipped away. He sat among them not as a father or grandfather, not as the man who once carried them on his shoulders and built the very roof above their heads, but as the punchline of their jokes.
"The man of the garage,"
they called him, their voices soaked with irony, as though all his years of labor had been nothing more than wasted hours surrounded by rust. Whenever he tried to share a story, to explain how once a broken machine had come back to life beneath his hands, the words barely escaped his lips before the grandchildren's eyes rolled toward the ceiling. They sighed in impatience, the way young ones do when they believe the old have nothing left to teach. His daughter pressed her lips together, trying not to show discomfort, but she never stopped them. His son-in-law, emboldened by silence, led the laughter, each remark cutting deeper than the last. So he learned to sit quietly. His silence was not agreement, it was survival. He let them speak over him, let them dismiss him, let them pretend his hands had never built the very table they were eating from. He stared at his plate, moving food without appetite, and let the sting sink deeper into his bones. The garage became his refuge, the only place where he was not a relic, not a burden, not a joke. Among the tools, he still felt like a man. Among the family, he felt like a ghost. But even as humiliation pressed down on him, he refused to let his silence turn into hatred. He carried it instead like a weight on his shoulders, a cross he bore alone. For he knew life had a way of circling back, of revealing truths in moments no one expected. And though they laughed, though they scorned, though they mocked the rusted tools and the man who still believed in their worth, he whispered in the quiet of his heart, "The day will come when silence will no longer be mine, but theirs." The storm came without warning, a heavy curtain of rain slamming against the roof and windows, the wind howling like a wounded beast through the empty streets. Inside his house, the old man sat in his worn chair, the rhythm of the storm filling the silence that had long been his companion. The garage door was shut tight, yet he could almost feel the tools inside, resting patiently on their shelves, waiting like soldiers who had not forgotten their duty. He leaned back, listening to the storm's fury, and for a moment it felt as though the world outside was echoing the unrest inside his chest. The thunder rolled deep, shaking the walls, and he closed his eyes, letting memory drift in. The laughter at the table, the mockery, the sting of betrayal that had left scars deeper than any wound of labor. The storm outside felt like the storm of his life, relentless, unyielding, merciless. Yet as always he endured, silent, unmoved, like the steel he had trusted all his years. Then, Through the roar of the rain, another sound cut sharply across the night. Tires skidding on wet pavement, brakes shrieking, a harsh cough of an engine gasping for breath before dying altogether. The light came next, headlights flickering wildly through his window, casting long, broken shadows on the wall. He sat up, his heart beating heavier now, not in fear, but in the strange recognition that life had shifted. He stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside, through the blur of rain, he saw the shape of a car, hunched at the edge of the street, steam curling from under its hood. The storm showed no mercy, pelting the stranded vehicle, drowning the cries of those inside. Yet even through the downpour he recognized them. His breath caught as he stared. It was not strangers who had been brought to his doorstep this night. It was his own family, the very ones who had laughed at him, who had called his tools nothing but rust and ruin. He did not move at once. He stood still, watching the blurred outlines of their figures as they climbed out, their coats clutched around them, their faces etched with worry. The irony struck him with quiet force. All the nights they had mocked him, all the times they had reduced him to a relic, and now fate had carried their broken machine to the one place they swore was useless. The storm raged louder, but inside him there was only stillness, as if the years of humiliation had been leading to this moment. He turned from the window and walked toward the garage. The rain hammered harder, the wind screamed through the cracks, and the world itself seemed to lean closer, waiting for what would come next. The car came to a violent halt, its last breath rattling into silence as steam rose into the night air. Rain lashed against the metal roof, lightning split the sky, and in that flash he saw them. His daughter clutching the children close, the son-in-law slamming the useless hood in frustration, their voices muffled by the storm but heavy with panic. For a moment he stood at the window, his hand resting on the curtain, his heart torn between the ache of betrayal and the pull of blood. These were his own, the ones who had laughed at him, the ones who had stripped him of dignity with their careless words. And yet here they were, helpless, their pride broken down on the very street where they had mocked him. The son-in-law's face twisted, anger and fear blending as he tried again and again to start the engine, the starter clicking in vain. His daughter's eyes darted toward the house, shame flickering through her expression even in the lightning's brief glow. The children huddled together, their bravado gone, replaced by wide-eyed fear as the storm raged around them. The sight pierced him deeply, not because he enjoyed their suffering, but because life itself had written a cruel lesson that no lecture of his could have ever delivered. He felt the weight of years pressing down on him, the nights of silence, the quiet humiliation, the burden of being unseen in his own family. And now, in this rain-soaked street, fate had brought them to his door, not in triumph, but in need. He could almost hear the echo of their past laughter, the man of the garage, the scrapyard of junk, now drowned beneath the thunder and the choking cough of their stalled car. Inside him, there was no joy, no vengeance, only a heavy silence that spoke louder than fury. He turned from the window, his steps steady, the old wood of the floor creaking beneath his weight. Each stride toward the garage was measured, deliberate, as though every second carried the memory of the years they had denied him. He reached for the handle of the garage door, and as it groaned open, the storm seemed to hush for a heartbeat. The rows of tools gleamed faintly in the dim light, waiting, faithful, as if they too had been holding their breath for this moment. And in that instant, he knew the storm outside was not an accident. It was justice, carried on the wind and the rain, delivered to his doorstep by fate itself. The car had died where it was meant to die, before the house of the man they had cast aside. The knock came timid at first, then again louder, though still uncertain. The storm pounded against the roof as if urging him to answer, but he did not rush. He let them wait in the rain, let them feel the weight of their helplessness. When he finally opened the door, the light spilled across their faces, his daughter's eyes lowered in shame, the grandchildren clutching her coat, and the son-in-law standing stiff, trying to hide his embarrassment, but failing. Their clothes were soaked through, their hair plastered to their foreheads, their pride drowned by the storm. "The car. It broke down. We don't know what to do," his daughter murmured, her voice small, stripped of the confidence she once carried when she joined in the laughter at his expense. Behind her, the children shivered, their bravado replaced by fear. The son-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tight, but his eyes betrayed him. There was no plan, no answer, no escape. The old man stood in the doorway, his figure still, his hand gripping the frame as memories flooded in. He could hear every cruel word echoing back. A scrapyard, a graveyard of junk, the man of the garage. He could see every time they had dismissed him, every time his stories had been cut short, every time silence had been his only defense. And now here they were, not with laughter but with pleading eyes, not with mockery but with desperation. He said nothing. His silence pressed heavier than the storm. They shifted uncomfortably, the son-in-law coughing as though to fill the void, the children glancing nervously at one another. The shame was written on their faces, carved deeper with every second he refused to speak. For a long moment, the rain filled the space between them. It was almost as if the storm itself demanded an answer. Yet he gave none. He simply looked at them, calm, steady, unbroken. His silence reminded them of what they had forgotten, that dignity does not need to shout, and worth does not vanish because others fail to see it. When at last he stepped aside, it was not out of weakness, but out of strength. He knew this was the moment life had carried to his door, and he would meet it not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the same quiet endurance that had carried him through years of scorn. He turned toward the garage, his footsteps steady, and the family, still dripping with rain, followed in silence. The storm raged on, hammering the roof of the garage as the family stood behind him, their shoes dripping onto the concrete floor. The old man did not turn at once. He busied himself with the quiet ritual of pulling open a drawer, the metallic rattle of tools filling the silence like a song only he understood. He let the weight of the moment press down, let them feel what it meant to stand in the very place they had once mocked. The smell of oil and iron hung thick in the air, foreign to them but familiar to him, as comforting as an old hymn. It was the son-in-law who broke first. His voice cracked, thin, barely louder than the storm outside, but every word was heavy with swallowed pride. "Could you look at it?" The words did not come easily. They dragged out of his throat like stones pulled from the mud. His eyes darted away, refusing to meet the old man's gaze, as if shame itself had taken hold of his neck. The daughter stood silent, wringing her hands, her eyes shimmering with something that looked like regret. The children shuffled their feet, glancing around the garage with uneasy stares. Only now did they seem to notice the careful order. The tools hung with precision, the shelves where nothing was out of place. It was not chaos, not a scrapyard. It was discipline, years of knowledge carved into every corner. Their earlier laughter echoed in their heads, and the sound of it turned sour against the reality before them. The old man remained silent. He did not gloat, did not smile, did not remind them of the words they had once thrown at him like stones. Instead, he picked up a wrench, heavy in his hand, the cold steel biting into his palm like it had countless times before. He turned it slowly, letting the light catch its worn edges. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting, uncertain, restless under the crushing weight of their own hypocrisy. For a long moment he said nothing. The storm outside filled the space between breaths, as if the night itself had paused to witness their humiliation. And then, with quiet steadiness, he stepped past them into the rain, his shoulders straight, his steps unhurried. The family followed, heads lowered, their pride drowned not by the storm, but by the realization that the man they had mocked was now the only one who could save them. The night seemed to hold its breath as he returned to the garage, the storm pounding against the walls like a restless drum. He moved with a calmness that felt heavier than anger, a dignity sharpened by years of silence. His hand reached for the first drawer, and as he pulled it open, the sound of metal against metal filled the air, a sharp, resonant note that cut through the storm outside. It was not the clatter of rust, not the noise of scrap, but the voice of steel, steady and true, ringing out like a bell of justice. One by one he revealed them, wrenches lined in order, screwdrivers with worn handles, sockets gleaming faintly under the dim light, hammers resting like old soldiers waiting for command. They did not lie forgotten. They waited, patient and loyal, alive with the memory of the hands that had once used them to mend and build and save. To those who stood trembling behind him, the sight was unsettling. This was no scrapyard. This was no pile of junk. It was an arsenal, every piece forged by necessity, every mark a testament to endurance. The grandchildren who had once laughed at the thought of this place stared in silence. They could see how carefully each tool was placed, how the walls bore not chaos, but the discipline of a lifetime. The son-in-law shifted uneasily, the mockery he had once carried so easily now choking him. His daughter's face was pale, her eyes moving slowly from tool to tool as if seeing for the first time what she had chosen never to notice before. The old man lifted a wrench from its place, weighing it in his hand as naturally as one lifts a pen to write a letter. His fingers fit the handle as though it were an extension of his own bones. The steel caught the trembling light, and for a moment it seemed to glow, undeniable in its presence, undeniable in its worth. He did not speak. He did not need to. The sound of the drawer sliding shut, the clang of the wrench against another piece of iron, these were his words. And in that silence, broken only by the storm and the breathing of those who watched him, the truth settled heavy and unshakable. What they had once called worthless was about to prove itself beyond measure. The tools, mocked and dismissed, were awake again, and through them, so was he. The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drumming against the hood of the car as if to drown out every sound except the storm itself. But beneath the glare of the headlights, his figure stood calm, steady, unmoved by the weather. He opened the hood with practiced ease, the hinges groaning in protest, steam rising in angry bursts into the cold night air. The family huddled a few steps away, their clothes soaked, their eyes wide, watching as the man they had mocked bent over the broken machine with the patience of someone who had done this all his life. His hands did not tremble. Each movement was precise, guided by memory older than any of the children watching. The wrench in his palm turned with a confidence that spoke of decades. Bolts loosening under strength that had not abandoned him. Wires stripped and reconnected with a knowledge no book could teach. He worked with the silence of one who had done this 1,000 times before, every twist and turn an act of quiet defiance against the words that had tried to erase him. The storm did not matter. The cold did not matter. The years that weighed on his back did not matter. In that moment, there was only the machine and the man who refused to let it remain dead. Raindrops slid across his lined face, but his eyes never faltered. His tools, once ridiculed, moved with the grace of instruments in the hands of a master. Where others saw rust, he saw life. Where others saw junk, he saw possibility. Behind him, shame thickened in the air heavier than the rain. The son-in-law clenched his jaw, no longer daring to speak. His daughter held her children close, their small eyes fixed on the scene with a mixture of fear and awe. They could feel it, the undeniable truth in every turn of the wrench, in every spark of connection. This was not the work of an old man clinging to the past. This was the work of hands that still carried purpose, still carried power, still carried dignity no insult could erase. And then, as his fingers pressed the last piece into place, as the connections tightened, he leaned back and wiped the water from his brow with the old rag that had followed him for years. The family held their breath. He gave the signal with nothing but a nod. The son-in-law turned the key, and for a heartbeat there was silence, a silence so heavy it seemed to stop the rain itself. Then the engine coughed, groaned, and roared alive, steady and strong, the sound tearing through the storm like a lion's cry. The light of the headlights brightened. the machine humming with renewed strength. And in that sound was justice. In that sound was memory. In that sound was the truth they had tried to bury, but could never destroy. The storm did not relent, yet in that small stretch of street it felt as though time had slowed to nothing but rain and silence. They stood a few paces behind him, their clothes clinging heavy to their bodies, their faces pale and stiff, each drop of water mixing with the salt of humiliation. They had mocked him, reduced him to a relic, laughed at the hands that now moved with a grace none of them could imitate. Every motion he made under the hood struck them harder than any word of reproach could have. He was not lecturing, not scolding, not demanding apologies. He was simply working, and that was enough to strip their pride bare. The son-in-law lowered his head. His arrogance drowned with the storm. No clever remark came to his lips. No laugh rose in his throat. Only silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Unavoidable. The daughter clutched her coat tighter, her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to look at the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, the same man she had allowed to be shamed at her table. The children huddled close, their usual giggles stilled, their eyes wide and unblinking, as they watched a truth unfold that no storybook could ever teach them. The rain beat harder, but the old man seemed untouched by it. He did not curse the weather, did not complain of his soaked clothes or the chill creeping into his bones. He bent over the engine with calm precision, each turn of the wrench, each tightening of a bolt a silent declaration that his worth was never theirs to measure. His dignity did not need their recognition. It shone on its own, steady as the glow of the headlights bouncing off the wet pavement. They realized then that they had not only mocked his tools, they had mocked resilience, patience, sacrifice itself. And now, standing in the storm, they were forced to watch as those very things saved them, while their own hands remained useless at their sides. The shame was unbearable, yet he gave them no release, no words of comfort, no invitation to ease their guilt. He allowed the silence to do what his voice never had to, reveal the truth. In that rain-soaked moment, his silence thundered louder than any storm. The key turned with hesitation, as though even his son-in-law feared the outcome. And for a moment, there was only the strained cough of metal and silence so deep it seemed the rain itself paused to listen. Then, like a beast awakening from slumber, the engine roared to life, louder, steadier, stronger than it had sounded in months. The vibration filled the night, rattling through the wet air, echoing down the street, as if declaring a verdict none of them could escape. The grandchildren gasped, their small bodies jerking at the sudden surge of power, eyes wide with awe that burned away every trace of their earlier giggles. Their laughter had died with the car on the roadside, and in its place came silence, a silence of recognition, of shame, of something they would never forget. His daughter pressed a hand to her lips, tears stinging her eyes as she watched the man they had tried to reduce to nothing stand taller in the glow of headlights, his soaked clothes clinging to him like armor, his tools gleaming in the rain like weapons of truth. The son-in-law's face drained of color, his pride collapsing under the weight of reality. The man he had ridiculed, belittled, erased with words, now stood as the only reason they would leave this night safely. Every arrogant remark he had once thrown now rang back at him in cruel echoes, and he could not hide from them, not with the engine thundering like judgment in his ears. His hands clenched and unclenched, but there was nothing he could do to reclaim the dignity he had so easily stolen from another. The old man said nothing. He did not look at them for approval, did not smile for gratitude, did not gloat over their silence. He simply wiped his hands on the old rag, folded his tools back into their places, and let the sound of the living engine speak for him. That roar was his vindication, his proof, his voice. It was louder than mockery, stronger than betrayal. and it carried a truth they could never again deny. No one dared to laugh any more. The storm still poured, but in their hearts it was the engine's roar that deafened them, a sound that would haunt their memories long after the rain had passed. The rain still fell in heavy sheets, but he no longer felt it. His task was finished, the engine's steady hum filling the night like a hymn of vindication. He did not wait for thanks, did not turn to meet their eyes. Instead, he reached for the old rag that had followed him through decades of work, wiping the grease from his hands with the same patience he had always shown, the same quiet care that had never asked for recognition. The rag was worn thin, its fabric frayed at the edges, but it carried more dignity than any fine cloth could ever hold. He placed each tool back in its place, sliding drawers closed with careful precision, the metallic clicks echoing like punctuation marks in a sentence he had written not with words but with action. Every sound of steel returning to rest spoke louder than any speech he could have given, proof that his life had never been junk, that his worth had never been rust, that silence could cut deeper than fury. When at last he turned from the garage, he did not glance toward the family still standing in the rain, their faces pale, their mouths shut. He did not need to. The silence between them was thick, unshakable, filled with everything they now understood and everything they could no longer deny. His daughter's lips trembled, wanting to speak but finding no words. The son-in-law's head hung low, his pride shattered, his arrogance drowned. The children, their small faces pressed close to their mother's side, looked at him with something they had never shown before, something close to fear, something close to reverence, but he asked for none of it. He walked slowly, deliberately back into the dim light of his garage, shoulders straight, back unbowed. He closed the door behind him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the calm finality of a man who had nothing left to prove. His silence was heavier than thunder, more piercing than rebuke, more lasting than scorn. In that moment, they realized he did not need revenge. He did not need prideful words or hollow victories. His dignity was unshakable, carved not from their approval, but from a lifetime of endurance, of labor, of truth. And as the storm softened into a steady drizzle, they stood there, wet, ashamed, broken, not from his fury, but from the weight of his silence. Years passed, and the storm of that night faded into memory, but the lesson it carried never left them. They no longer spoke of the rain or the panic on the roadside, nor did they linger on the embarrassment of being stranded with nowhere to turn. What remained, what grew heavier with every retelling, was the image of him, standing in the rain with calm hands, bringing life back into a dead machine with the same tools they had once laughed at. That night became a turning point, a line in their family's story that could not be erased. The children, now grown, would whisper about it with awe. "Do you remember," they would say to one another, "how Grandpa brought the car back from nothing?" The laughter they once shared at his expense had long ago soured into regret, replaced by reverence. They no longer saw him as an old man in a dusty garage. They saw him as a figure of quiet strength, someone who had carried a kind of power they could never name, a dignity that no storm could wash away. His daughter would often sit in silence when the memory returned, her eyes damp as she recalled the way she had lowered her gaze while her husband mocked her father. She would remember the shame that gripped her chest when she stood in the rain, watching the man she had failed to defend labor without complaint. And though she tried at times to voice her regret, he had never asked for it. His silence had already forgiven her, though it had also marked her, etched into her heart a reminder that love without courage is as hollow as laughter at another's pain. The son-in-law, once so quick to ridicule, grew older too. But with his age came a bitterness that never left him. He could never undo the sight of his arrogance crumbling that night, never erase the memory of begging, quietly, awkwardly, for help from the very man he had belittled. He lived with it like a shadow, every glance at a toolbox, every sound of an engine sparking to life, a reminder that worth cannot be mocked out of existence. It can only be hidden until the moment truth demands its return. And the garage itself, once dismissed as a graveyard of junk, transformed in their eyes. It became sacred ground, not because of what it held, but because of what it represented. They no longer saw rusted tools or worn wooden shelves. They saw endurance, sacrifice, resilience, a life's work stored in rows of steel and wood. To step inside was to feel the weight of history, the presence of a man whose silence had thundered louder than their scorn. When he was gone, they did not measure his legacy in wealth or titles. There were no estates, no fortunes, no plaques with his name. What he left was far greater. The undeniable truth that dignity outlives mockery, that resilience silences ridicule, and that the things dismissed as worthless are often the very things that save us. His name was spoken differently after that, not with laughter, not with dismissal, but with a quiet respect that carried through generations. And so the story was told, not of a storm, not of a broken car, but of the man in the garage, the father, the craftsman, the silent figure whose tools, once ridiculed, became the instruments of salvation. The garage lived on, not as a place of rust, but as a shrine of resilience. His legacy was unerasable, etched into memory with the sound of an engine's roar in the rain, and the silence of a man who needed no fury to be remembered.